The emergence and rapid development of American bomber aviation stands as one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of aircraft design. And the essence of this transformation lies not simply in the fact that the United States entered World War II with little more than a symbolic bomber force, only to finish the war with the most powerful fleet of strategic bombers on Earth. The real significance was deeper. The United States proved, to itself and to the entire world, that in a global war, only overwhelming qualitative and quantitative superiority in heavy bomber aviation could decisively shape the outcome. America's unmatched industrial power gave birth to an entirely new branch of armed forces, strategic aviation, an instrument not only of military force, but of political and economic pressure as well. At the peak of production, the U.S. aviation industry reached output levels never seen before, up to 50 heavy bombers per day. Even on their most successful days, the Axis powers were incapable of destroying aircraft at such a rate, while thousands of tons of explosives rained down on their industrial centers. By the end of the war, the U.S. strategic bomber fleet outnumbered the combined total of similar aircraft anywhere else in the world, by several times over. And yet, the story began in a far more modest way. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps introduced a new twin-engine bomber, the Martin B-10. It served as the primary bomber through the late 1930s and was built in what can only be described, by American standards, as laughably small numbers. Across all variants, B-10, B-12, and B-14, including prototypes, only 151 aircraft were produced. Another 206 were sold abroad in export versions, primarily to the Netherlands. The B-10 even saw combat during World War II with the Chinese Air Force. Despite having a top speed higher than that of every U.S. fighter then in service, the aircraft lagged noticeably behind leading European designs, especially in bomb load and range. The Americans had no intention of accepting that gap. In February 1934, the Army Air Corps issued a specification designated XBLR, known as Project A, calling for an ultra-long-range bomber capable of delivering 900 kilograms of bombs over a distance of 8,000 kilometers. It is important to note that these ambitious range requirements were not driven by foresight of future strategic bombing campaigns, but by far more practical concerns. At the time, U.S. political, economic, and military interests were focused almost exclusively on the Pacific region, an area defined by vast distances and underdeveloped infrastructure. Aircraft were required to cover long ferry ranges between scattered airfields across the ocean. Contracts were issued to Boeing, Douglas, and Martin. Martin's proposals were eliminated early. Its four-engine XBLR, designated XB-16, never progressed beyond the drawing board. The six-engine XB-16-2, presented in 1935, met the same fate. Boeing's design received the internal designation Model 294. Construction of the XBLR-1 prototype began in the summer of 1934. Later redesignated XB-15, it became the largest aircraft ever built in the United States up to that point, with a wingspan exceeding 45 meters. Powered by four Pratt & Whitney R-1830-11 twin Wasp engines producing 850 horsepower each, the prototype first flew in October 1937. However, due to its enormous cost and disappointing flight performance, largely caused by underpowered engines, the aircraft never entered production. Instead, the XB-15 remained in service as a transport aircraft, setting several records for heavy cargo lifting. Douglas, meanwhile, proposed a highly original four-engine bomber concept of its own. But during the depths of the Great Depression, the government could afford to fund only one prototype, and Boeing's XB-15 was selected. As a result, Douglas did not complete its prototype, designated XBLR-2 and later XB-19, until June 1941. In terms of sheer size, Douglas surpassed all competitors. Even the massive XB-15 appeared small next to the colossal XB-19, which measured over 40 meters in length and nearly 65 meters in wingspan. The prototype took its first flight on June 27, 1941. Its bomb bays could carry more than 16 tons of bombs. Yet neither the Wright R-3350-5 Cyclone engines nor the later Allison V-3420-11 engines, producing 2,600 horsepower, could provide acceptable performance for such a giant. Given the extraordinary cost of construction, the Air Corps quickly abandoned any plans for mass production. Like its Boeing rival, the aircraft was relegated to transport duties. Also in 1934, shortly after the XBLR specification was issued, the Air Corps released a far more modest requirement for a heavy bomber capable of carrying twice the bomb load of the B-10 over twice the range. The specification, designated 35-26, was again issued to Boeing, Douglas, and Martin, with the winner guaranteed an immediate order for 220 aircraft. Martin chose the simplest and least expensive route, incremental improvement of the B-10/B-12 design. Using the export B-10 Model 139 as a base, the company developed the Model 146 prototype, submitted to evaluation at Wright Field in August 1935 under the designation B-10B. However, performance gains were minimal, and the project was deemed unpromising. Further development was cancelled. Drawing on experience gained from the commercial DC-2, Douglas encountered few difficulties in developing its bomber, designated DB-1. The design remained largely unchanged from the DC-2, with the addition of gun positions, a bomb bay, and crew accommodations. Simplicity and reliability worked in its favor. In January 1936, a production order was placed for the bomber under the designation B-18. The first contract covered 133 aircraft, including the prototype, followed by 177 more in 1937 and another 40 in 1938. By early 1940, the Douglas B-18 BOLO had become the primary bomber in U.S. service. Even in 1942, after most B-18s had been replaced by the B-17, many remained in service, converted into maritime patrol and anti-submarine aircraft designated B-18B. Further development led to the experimental B-22, fitted with more powerful Wright R-2600-3 engines producing 1,600 horsepower. However, the design never entered series production. More substantial changes were introduced in 1938. The fuselage was lengthened, its cross-section reduced, wing and tail surfaces enlarged, and a tail gun was added. The prototype of this improved bomber, designated B-23, first flew on July 27, 1939, demonstrating a significant improvement in performance. All ordered aircraft were completed by the end of 1939 and entered service as the B-23 Dragon. Yet even this design proved too weak to compete with contemporary European bombers already battle-tested in combat. No further orders followed, and the limited number produced were converted to auxiliary roles. Earlier, in the spring of 1937, North American Aviation had proposed its own modernization of the BOLO. The aircraft was fitted with Pratt & Whitney R-2180-1 Hornet engines rated at 1,200 horsepower, nearly doubling its bomb load. The prototype, designated NA-21 and later XB-21, was approved, and in the summer of 1937 the Air Corps ordered 5 pre-production YB-21 aircraft. However, construction was halted after a single example was completed. Once again, the reason was simple: insufficient competitiveness. The Douglas B-23 Dragon was intended to replace the B-18 as the primary bomber and represented a clear improvement over its predecessor. Yet due to a combination of technical limitations and rapidly advancing wartime requirements, it never received the development it deserved. For Boeing's engineers, this contract was nothing less than decisive. After the failure of the B-9 bomber, the only moderately successful commercial airliner Model 247 introduced in 1933, the company's first step into passenger aviation, and the enormous financial burden of the XB-15 project, Boeing found itself in a dangerously fragile position. The company's future, indeed, its very survival, now depended on securing this new order. On September 26, 1934, Boeing's board of directors allocated $275,000 for the development of a prototype meeting specification 35 to 26. By the time construction was complete, that figure had nearly doubled. A design team led by Gifford Emery and Edward Wells began work on a bomber under the internal designation Model 299. The experience gained from Models 247 and 294 proved invaluable. In essence, the new aircraft was based on the Model 247 airliner, but instead of 2 engines, it carried 4, following the concept tested earlier on the B-15. On July 17, 1935, the Model 299 prototype rolled out of Boeing's Seattle factory, and just 11 days later, on July 28, it made its maiden flight. Over the next 3 weeks, it completed 7 additional test flights. On August 20, the aircraft was delivered to Wright Field for comparative trials against the Martin Model 146, B-10B, and the Douglas DB-1, B-18 Buell. The results were nothing short of stunning. Even the designers themselves had not expected such performance. The prototype effortlessly exceeded every requirement of the specification: speed, range, and service ceiling, leaving all competitors far behind. A reporter from the Seattle Times, witnessing the demonstration, jokingly referred to the aircraft as a flying fortress. The name stuck, and would become legendary. Then, on October 30, the unthinkable happened. Due to crew error, the aircraft lost control, crashed, and burned completely. Boeing test pilot Tower was killed. The accident nearly became a catastrophe for the company itself. Boeing was disqualified from the competition and found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. The DB-1 was declared the winner, and Boeing lost the contract for the first 65 production aircraft. Fortunately, on January 12, 1936, the Army Air Corps placed an order with Boeing for 13 pre-production bombers as a consolation prize. These aircraft, designated Y-1B-17, soon revealed numerous structural issues, particularly engine failures and landing gear problems. These flaws led to another fatal accident on December 7, 1936. As a result, Boeing lost yet another contract when Congress approved the purchase of an additional 253 B-18s instead. The primary reason was simple: the new bomber cost nearly twice as much as the Buell. Despite this, the Air Corps leadership was deeply impressed by the performance of the Y-1B-17 and insisted on moving forward with series production. The final aircraft of the pre-production batch was modified with more powerful R-1820-51 engines equipped with turbochargers, increasing top speed by an additional 20%. This version, designated Y-1B-17A, made its first flight on April 29, 1938. In this form, featuring a significantly redesigned nose section, the bomber entered production in July 1939 as the B-17B. A total of 39 aircraft were built. To Boeing's deep disappointment, production of the B-17B resulted in financial losses. The company demanded an increase in procurement price, threatening to halt production entirely. Congress eventually conceded, setting a record price for a production aircraft at $202,500. The B-17C was delivered to the U.S. Army Air Corps through late 1940, with 38 aircraft produced. Another 20 were transferred to Britain under Lend-Lease as the Superfortress I. These were later returned for upgrades to the B-17D standard, which entered production in February 1941 and totaled 42 aircraft. From a design standpoint, the B, C, and D variants differed only slightly. These were, in fact, all the flying fortresses with which the United States entered the war. Most were destroyed on the very first day, without flying a single combat mission. On December 7, 1941, all 12 B-17DS stationed at Hickam Field in Pearl Harbor were burned on the ground. Another 18 B-17CS and B-17DS were destroyed at Clark Field in the Philippines. The only major combat action involving these early fortresses is associated with Captain Colin Kelly, who was credited with a successful attack on the battleship Haruna, allegedly ramming and damaging the ship. In reality, Kelly was killed while attempting to keep his damaged aircraft airborne long enough for his crew to bail out. The timing of the crash coincided with the withdrawal of a different vessel, a Japanese heavy cruiser, for repairs. The remaining aircraft were redeployed to Australia, from where they conducted raids in defense of Java, operating via an auxiliary airfield in New Guinea. These operations also ended unsuccessfully. Boeing fell nearly 6 months behind schedule with the introduction of the new B-17E, hampered by severe shortages of funds and raw materials. The B-17E differed from earlier variants primarily through the addition of a ventral fin and a substantial increase in defensive armament, most notably the introduction of a tail turret. The aircraft entered service only in the spring of 1942 and took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was a formation of B-17Es that first detected the Japanese naval forces advancing toward Port Moresby. In the summer of 1942, 45 B-17Es were transferred to Britain under the designation Fortress IIA. That same June, a new version, the B-17F, entered service. This was the first truly mass-produced Fortress. Externally, it differed little from the B-17E, but internally it incorporated more than 400 improvements, primarily in armor protection, power plants, fuel tank arrangement, and onboard systems. As a result, range and bomb load increased significantly, and survivability improved. However, by January 1943, flying fortresses had virtually disappeared from the Pacific theater, with only a few B-17Fs remaining in the 5th Bomb Group. The reason was clear. On January 27, 1943, the first large-scale bombing raid against Germany was carried out by consolidated B-24 Liberators, with B-17s participating as well. Losses among unescorted bombers rose catastrophically, sometimes reaching 20% per mission. The myth of the flying fortress's invulnerability was shattered. Even accounting for its advantages over competitors, the average combat life expectancy of a B-17 at that time was just 21 missions. In contrast, in the Pacific, where combat took place at medium altitudes, the high-altitude performance of the Fortress was less critical, and B-24s could successfully replace it. It was for Europe, with its dense and highly developed air defense networks, head-on attacks by ramming FW-190s, and jet-powered Me-262s, that Boeing created its most numerous and most combat-capable variant, the B-17G. A total of 8,680 aircraft were produced. The nose was armed with 3 turret installations, nicknamed the Chin and Cheeks for their distinctive appearance. Serial production began in early autumn 1943, drawing heavily on experience gained from the XB-40 air cruiser, a heavily armed escort bomber developed specifically to protect bomber formations. In essence, the XB-40 was a 4-engine heavy escort fighter grown out of the B-17 airframe. The XB-40, built by Lockheed Vega, made its first flight on November 10, 1942. While its combat effectiveness was limited due to insufficient power, the experience gained in weapons placement proved invaluable for the B-17G. At Lockheed Vega, another prototype was developed based on the B-17E, the XB-38 long-range heavy bomber, which first flew on May 19, 1943. It was powered by liquid-cooled Allison V-1710-89 engines rated at 1,425 horsepower, intended as an alternative in case of cyclone engine shortages. Performance gains were modest, and since these engines were urgently needed for fighter production, the B-38 program was cancelled. Consolidated attempted a similar experiment with the B-24, producing the XB-41 escort fighter. Completed in late 1942, it was the longest-range escort fighter in U.S. service at the time and carried 14 .50 caliber machine guns. However, poor test results ended the program after a single prototype. The B-17G saw no service over the Pacific. Instead, another heavy bomber successfully took its place. In 1938, representatives of the U.S. Army Air Corps visited Consolidated's headquarters in San Diego to discuss the possibility of producing the B-17 at the company's facilities. After reviewing Fortress documentation, Consolidated proposed an alternative, a bomber with higher performance, greater range and bomb load, and, most importantly, lower cost. The proposal centered on the use of a new high-aspect ratio wing developed by the company's engineers under David Davis. Previously, Consolidated had focused primarily on flying boats. The success of the PBY Catalina, one of the finest aircraft of its type, earned the company the military's confidence. Another flying boat, Model 31, which utilized the Davis wing, served as the basis for a new land-based bomber. On February 21, 1939, a contract was signed for the construction of the Model 32 prototype, later designated XB-24. Just 9 months later, on December 29, 1939, the aircraft made its first flight, an extraordinarily short development time by U.S. standards. This was achieved while the team, led by Reuben Fleet and chief designer Isaac Ladd-Don, simultaneously worked on a pre-production batch of 7 YB-24s, export versions designated LB-30A, preparations for B-24A series production, and the C-87 transport variant. Testing at Wright Field was largely successful. The XB-24 demonstrated a range 320 km greater than the production B-17C, and with auxiliary tanks, nearly 960 km more, while carrying a heavier bomb load. At high altitude, it was slightly slower than the Fortress, but it held an advantage at low and medium altitudes. Its service ceiling was noticeably lower. Military pilots particularly praised the tricycle landing gear, which offered significant advantages during takeoff and landing and greatly reduced accident rates. Serial production of the Liberator began in August 1939, starting with 120 bombers ordered by France. In practice, these aircraft were essentially a slightly improved version of the pre-production YB-24s. Early export B-24s reached Britain under the designation LB-30A, and it was the British who gave the aircraft its name, Liberator I. After France's rapid defeat, Consolidated managed to complete only 20 examples of the B-24A. These were also offered to Britain and, after receiving the export index LB-30B, entered RAF service as Liberator II. These were, in fact, the first Liberators to see combat, most often in the role of Royal Air Force Maritime Patrol and anti-submarine aircraft. Only 9 B-24s entered U.S. Army Air Forces service in the summer of 1941, and even then they were used largely in auxiliary roles. For Britain, however, production continued. 140 of the 167 ordered Liberator II aircraft were completed. The unsatisfactory high-altitude speed performance demonstrated by the XB-24 at Wright Field pushed Consolidated to rethink the powerplant. The prototype was refitted with Pratt & Whitney R-1830-41 engines rated at 1,200 horsepower. Their two-speed superchargers were replaced by General Electric B-2 turbo superchargers, optimized for altitude. The result was the XB-24B. On its first flight, February 1, 1941, it reached 496 km per hour at 6,100 meters, a major leap forward. Based on the XB-24B, Consolidated produced an intermediate series, the B-24C, totaling 40 aircraft. This batch existed mainly to debug production for the next series, the B-24D. The B-24C itself went to combat units largely for crew familiarization and was considered only conditionally fit for combat use. Only in early 1942 did the United States begin truly large-scale Liberator production. In early 1941, the government funded Consolidated to build a new plant in Texas. Then Douglas, Ford, and North American were brought into the B-24 program. Depending on where components were manufactured, aircraft received indices such as B-24D, B-24E, and B-24G, though in practical terms, these versions were not fundamentally different. Henry Ford's entry into the program, as the great architect of mass production, had an immediate and dramatic impact on output. By early 1944, the Willow Run plant was rolling a new B-24 off the line every 63 minutes. But this sprawling cooperative production created its own problems. Standardization was treated as an afterthought, which meant parts made on different tooling were often not interchangeable. Only with the introduction of the B-24J did all 5 partners finally bring production into a more unified standard and solve the worst of these issues. The B-24D began reaching combat units in July 1942, and the first missions quickly exposed a critical weakness: insufficient defensive firepower. Enemy fighters rapidly identified the Liberator's vulnerabilities: exposure to head-on attacks, slow roll response, and large blind zones in machine gun coverage, especially in the nose. Field modifications helped little until engineers made a decisive change, fitting the nose with the consolidated A-6 turret, the same type used in the tail. That upgrade produced a new major series, the B-24H, built in a total of 3,100 aircraft. Yet production chaos still showed through. Some B-24Hs differed sharply from others depending on where they were built. The pressure to standardize forced all plants, beginning in spring 1944, to shift to the B-24J, ultimately the most widely produced Liberator variant, with 6,678 aircraft built. The J model featured the electrically powered Emerson Electric A-15 nose turret and improved landing gear. Production of the B-24J continued through December 1944. Total B-24 production reached 18,188 aircraft, a world record for 4-engine airplanes. Even the more celebrated B-17 could not match those numbers. The reason was straightforward: Consolidated successfully organized large-scale manufacturing while cutting costs aggressively, reducing unit cost and, therefore, procurement price. It is common to compare the B-24 with the B-17. That is inevitable: same class, same mission, competing manufacturers, comparison is almost guaranteed. Yet the fairness of such comparisons is limited. The key reason is simple: in the overwhelming majority of cases, B-17s and B-24s were used on fundamentally different theaters of war. That means the loss ratio relative to total production, about 15% for the B-17 and 13% for the B-24, is not the best measurement of effectiveness. The B-17 was used primarily in the European theater, where the world's densest air defense networks were concentrated in a relatively small strategic area. In that environment, bomb load and range mattered, but survivability, protection, and high-altitude performance mattered more. In the Pacific, the B-24 was often the more optimal machine. Air defenses there were scattered across enormous distances and lacked the concentrated density and technical sophistication found in Europe. But the bombers had to fly immense ranges. These differences explain why, from early 1943, almost all fortresses were redeployed to Europe, while the number of B-24s there began to drop sharply from mid-1944. A brutal illustration of this reality was the near-suicidal low-level attack on the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania on August 1, 1943, carried out by 5 bomb groups. Of 164 B-24Ds launched from North Africa without fighter escort, only 88 returned. And only 33 of those were reparable without major rebuild, 55 required serious restoration. The mission's strategic goal, cutting Germany off from fuel supplies, was not achieved. In the Pacific, however, the picture could look very different. In raids ahead of the Philippines landings, the Liberator delivered significant results. In the field, the B-24 was not especially loved. It always lived in the shadow of the fortress. The reason was painfully simple: on a B-17, crews had a higher chance of survival. There are countless documented cases of B-17s returning to base on 2 engines, missing up to 30% of their lifting surfaces, landing without tail units, or even with the entire forward fuselage destroyed. The Fortress could absorb an astonishing number of direct hits. The B-24 could not match that toughness. The very feature engineers considered a triumph, the high aspect ratio Davis wing, often became a nightmare for crews. It placed heavy loads on control systems, produced sluggish roll stabilization due to inertia, and at low speeds the ailerons could feel ineffective. The shorter fuselage combined with that wing reduced longitudinal stability. And with the B-24 as a high-wing aircraft, landings became a high-risk operation, especially in damaged condition. Poor sealing of bomb bays meant that Liberators operating over water could flood rapidly during ditching. Crews sometimes went down before they could even deploy life rafts. But the most dangerous weak point remained the wing itself. Less structurally robust, and carrying higher loads than the B-17, its wing could fail after only a few hits, sometimes snapping in half. All of this made the Liberator unpopular in many units. And yet, despite its flaws, it became the true workhorse of U.S. bomber aviation. From mid-1944 onward, B-24 production began to wind down. Douglas and North American nearly ended output. Ford and Consolidated transitioned to improved models, the B-24L and B-24M, built in comparatively smaller numbers, 1,667 and 2,583 aircraft, respectively. The B-24D airframe also served as the basis for the long-range F-7 reconnaissance version, the C-87 transport, and the C-109 tanker. For the Navy, a maritime variant of the B-24D was produced as the PB-4Y-1. In March 1944, construction began on a naval model designed specifically for maritime operations, the consolidated PB-4Y-2 privateer, which differed from the B-24 with a single fin tail. A total of 739 PB-4Y-2s were built through October 1945. Failures with the XB-15 and XB-19 did not force the U.S. Army Air Corps to abandon the idea of a superbomber capable of reaching targets far beyond North America. The XBLR requirements were revised, and on January 29, 1940, the Air Corps issued a new VLR specification for an ultra-long-range bomber capable of carrying 900 kilograms of bombs out to 8,600 kilometers, with a maximum speed of 640 to 650 kilometers per hour. Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, and Consolidated received the requirement. Preliminary development contracts, designated XB-29, XB-30, XB-31, and XB-32, were signed on July 27. Funding for two prototypes, the XB-29 and XB-32, was allocated on August 24, 1940. The Douglas and Lockheed proposals were rejected. Boeing's design, on the other hand, impressed immediately, and so strongly that Boeing received a production order for 500 aircraft before the first prototype ever flew. Even so, the military hedged its bets by ordering 3 XB-32 prototypes from Consolidated as insurance. The XB-32 never became a true competitor, never even entered the race as a serious challenger. Misfortune followed Consolidated's program almost from the start, through a long but largely inglorious history. The company delivered the first prototype nearly 6 months late, and the contract for a pre-production batch was cancelled. The project was saved, and Consolidated received a production order for 300 bombers designated B-32 Terminator. Then the first prototype crashed, killing almost the entire crew. That disaster pushed schedules back another 6 months. 2 more prototypes were built in 1943, but the evaluation board concluded the aircraft was already becoming obsolete. Consolidated rushed through major redesigns. The program was saved again, and the contract was even expanded to 1,500 aircraft, but persistent technical problems kept delaying production. In an attempt to break the bad luck, the aircraft was renamed Dominator. It didn't help. By the end of December 1944, when B-29s had already been in combat for 6 months, only 5 production B-32s had reached operational units. Another 40, designated TB-32, were sent to training groups because their suitability remained in doubt. The B-32 flew its first combat mission only on May 29, 1945. Of 3 aircraft assigned, only 2 managed to take off. This was followed by a series of raids against targets on Formosa, the Philippines, and Hainan, rarely involving more than 4 bombers at a time. The Dominator's final combat sortie took place on August 28, 1945. Of 4 B-32s dispatched, only 2 returned to base, despite encountering no enemy opposition. In September 1945, the program was finally terminated. By then, only 115 B-32 and TB-32 aircraft had been produced. Just 8 were delivered to the 312th Group based on Okinawa, and only 4 of those were considered combat-ready. The rest were scrapped. The B-29, however, met a far more enviable fate. If not for a massive number of design and production shortcomings, it could rightfully be considered the benchmark of World War II long-range bombing, one where the super prefix would be fully justified. More than that, the B-29 became the first true representative of a new era of weaponry, an aircraft designed to carry nuclear weapons. It was no coincidence that Boeing's project received the highest priority. Construction of the prototype began in April 1941, and on September 21, 1942, the first XB-29, powered by Wright R-3350-13 engines, took to the air. 3 months later, the second prototype followed. But on February 18, 1943, an event occurred that would haunt the Superfortress throughout its entire career, making the word super only partly deserved. During a routine test flight, an engine caught fire on the second prototype. The aircraft lost control and crashed, killing all 11 crew members. This disaster was only the first in a long chain of accidents tied to engine failures, the true curse of the B-29 program. Pre-production YB-29s began arriving with the 58th Super Heavy Bombardment Wing in early summer 1943. Almost immediately, tragedy struck again. On June 1, 1943, the third XB-29 prototype was lost in another crash. By the end of 1943, only 67 pilots had completed training, and out of 97 bombers, just 16 were considered combat-ready. The nearly year-long struggle with the B-29's temperamental engines earned its own grim nickname, the Kansas Battle. Eventually, the effort to tame the aircraft achieved limited success. In March 1944, the first B-29 landed at Quanghan Airfield in China. The ferry route to India stretched roughly 18,000 kilometers, running across the Atlantic and through Morocco. Of 148 aircraft that reached Marrakesh, only 130 made it onward to India. Intake valves on the rear engine bank literally melted from heat, engines caught fire, and aircraft were grounded until May 8. Even after arriving in India, the bombers could not take off with full bomb loads, the runways were inadequate and had to be extended to 2,200 meters. Despite these obstacles, the first combat mission finally took place on June 5, 1944. The 20th Air Force, formed specifically around the Superfortress, launched a raid on Bangkok. 98 B-29s took off. 14 turned back before reaching the target. 5 crashed on landing. Another 42 were forced to divert to alternate fields due to fuel shortages. Only 18 bombs were dropped on the target, causing no measurable damage. The next operation, an attack on the Yada Steel Complex on Kyushu on June 14, 1944, was even more disastrous. Of 75 B-29s, 18 failed to get airborne, 1 exploded during takeoff, 1 was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and 6 more crashed due to engine fires. 55 crew members were killed. Only a single bomb landed, 1,200 meters from the aiming point. On July 7, of 100 B-29s scheduled for another raid on Kyushu, only 72 managed to take off, 60 reached the target area, and 54 returned to base. Bombing accuracy stood at just 7%. At this rate, the United States risked eliminating its own bomber force without any help from Japanese air defenses. The situation shifted somewhat in late summer 1944 with the arrival of General Curtis LeMay as commander of the 20th Air Force. He proposed replacing heavy bombs with small-caliber incendiaries. The next raid, against Anshan on September 26, 1944, achieved no decisive success, but losses were minimal. Even so, the cost had already been staggering. By the end of 1944, the United States had lost 147 of its newest bombers, essentially the entire force available at the end of spring 1944. That autumn, Command concluded that continued operations from Chengdu airfields were no longer practical. The capture of the Marianas made it possible to establish a new air base on Saipan, and the first missions from there began in early November 1944. The Japanese responded with a counterstrike on Saipan, destroying 10 B-29s and damaging several more. The first raid on the Japanese home islands was carried out only on November 24, 1944. Of 111 bombers launched, 17 returned due to engine problems. The rest encountered severe weather and failed to reach their targets. On November 27, another Japanese strike destroyed 7 more B-29s. Until December, raids produced virtually no results. Only on December 13 did American bombers inflict serious damage on Mitsubishi factories in Nagoya. On December 24, the Japanese struck Saipan again, 11 B-29s burned on the ground, and 43 were heavily damaged. The overall results of B-29 operations from the Marianas during the final 2 months of 1944 were deeply disappointing. With sorties averaging once every 4 days, losses reached 5 to 6 bombers per mission. Beginning in January 1945, the United States finally gained control of the situation. General LeMay issued a directive emphasizing night raids and the use of small incendiary bombs against residential districts in densely populated areas, dropped from high altitude. The world first recoiled at the phrase, carpet bombing. At noon on March 9, 1945, 325 B-29s lifted off from Guam. 279 reached Tokyo and, during the night of March 9 to 10, dropped 1,600 tons of incendiaries, devastating an area of 40 square kilometers. 84,000 civilians were killed, and more than 1 million were left homeless. The raid was repeated on the night of March 13 to 14, this time by 327 bombers. Throughout the spring of 1945, the most horrifying attacks were carried out against major industrial centers. Over 40% of urban areas were burned out. Each large-scale raid involved no fewer than 400 B-29s. Yet the most horrific crimes against humanity committed by the Superfortress were the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which claimed the lives of 164,000 civilians. Boeing repeatedly attempted to solve the B-29's engine problems through radical changes to the power plant. In 1944, engineers tried installing liquid-cooled Allison V-3420-11 engines, similar to those tested on the XB-38, rated at 2,100 horsepower, and up to 3,000 horsepower in emergency power. The sole prototype, designated XB-39 and named Spirit of Lincoln, underwent testing through the end of 1944 and demonstrated noticeable performance improvements. However, it never entered production. Another modernization effort had begun earlier, in mid-1943. The XB-44 was fitted with Pratt & Whitney R-4360-33 Wasp major engines producing 3,000 horsepower. This variant also failed to reach series production. War's end led Pratt & Whitney to halt engine manufacturing altogether. But strategic bombers were not the only aircraft shaping the rise of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Many successful medium and light designs played crucial roles as well. Two stand out in particular, the North American B-25 Mitchell and the Martin B-26 Marauder. The Douglas A-20 Havoc and A-26 Invader should also be included. To understand why aircraft labeled as attack planes ended up in bomber units, one must consider the U.S. Army Air Corps' approach to ground attack aviation. Until the summer of 1944, American forces had limited experience with large-scale ground operations, and their understanding of close air support doctrine remained vague. The Douglas SBD dive bomber, designated A-24 in its land-based version, had performed reasonably well early in the war but was already obsolete. A replacement was needed, yet aviation leadership lacked a clear vision of what a true attack aircraft should be. As a result, for much of the war the U.S. Army Air Forces operated without specialized close support aircraft. These missions were handled primarily by fighters such as the P-38, P-40, and P-47. Aircraft designed as attackers, including capable machines like the A-20 Havoc and A-26 Invader, failed to excel in their intended role, but proved valuable instead as medium-range bombers. Douglas began work on a fundamentally new medium bomber in 1936. The project received the designation Model 7A and later the Export Index DB-7. The prototype first flew on October 26, 1938, and by February 1939 the company had secured an order for 100 aircraft from the French Air Force. By the start of combat in May 1940, France had 60 of these bombers in service, 12 of which saw combat and performed well. After France's rapid defeat, Britain assumed responsibility for French and Belgian orders, and several aircraft from the first batch arrived in the UK as Havoc I. Their successful use prompted the U.S. Army Air Forces to consider domestic procurement. The first version adopted by the U.S. was the A-20A, broadly similar to the DB-7 but powered by R-2600-3 engines without turbochargers. To boost output, Douglas licensed production to Boeing, which built 140 A-20s for the Royal Air Force under Lend-Lease as Boston IIIA. DB-7 aircraft of this variant were also delivered to the Soviet Union. The next major production version was the A-20G, with 2,850 aircraft built. These were powered by R-2600-23 engines and armed with two 50 caliber machine guns and four 20 mm cannons in the nose. A subsequent A-20G variant replaced the cannons with 50 caliber machine guns and added underwing racks for 907 kilograms of bombs, auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay, and provisions for a jettisonable belly tank, allowing ranges exceeding 3,000 kilometers. This capability proved decisive in Pacific operations. Another four 12A-20H aircraft were produced, featuring R-2600-29 engines rated at 1,700 horsepower. In total, Douglas built 7,385 A-20s, which served successfully not only with the U.S. Army Air Forces but were also exported to Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The U.S. Army Air Corps received its first A-20s in the spring of 1941. The aircraft were assigned to the 3rd Bombardment Group. Just days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 58th Squadron, based at Hickam Field in Hawaii, also received its A-20s. During the Japanese raid, 10 of those aircraft were destroyed on the ground. In August 1942, A-20s arrived at Port Moresby in New Guinea as part of the 3rd Bombardment Group. It was there that a remarkably simple yet highly effective tactic was developed specifically for the A-20, the so-called gunship approach. Flying at very low altitude, the aircraft attacked Japanese transport convoys by first dropping bombs and then strafing surface targets with machine gun fire. The success of this method was so convincing that A-20 units were reorganized into the 5th Air Force under General Kenny. From New Guinea, these aircraft went on to operate over Palau and the Philippines. After the capture of Leyte, A-20s were able to conduct long-range strikes as far as Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, and the coast of China. The final battles involving the A-20 were fought over Okinawa, where the aircraft served with the 417th Bombardment Group. In New Guinea and Guadalcanal, the A-20 was also adapted as a dedicated night fighter under the designation P-70 Nighthawk. This role remained in use until the arrival of the purpose-built Northrop P-61 Black Widow. By American standards, the A-20 was a relatively small aircraft, crewed by just 2 men. Yet it made an invaluable contribution to Allied victory in the Pacific as a true workhorse, its versatility allowing the U.S. Army Air Forces to patch critical gaps in doctrine and tactics. The A-20 served in almost every imaginable role: bomber, attack aircraft, reconnaissance platform, torpedo bomber, maritime patrol aircraft, anti-submarine aircraft, and even as a fighter. Wherever it was used, pilots loved it. Time and again, this simple, rugged, and highly survivable machine brought its crews home at critical moments. It is worth noting that the most widely produced twin-engine bomber in U.S. service, the North American B-25 Mitchell, had originally competed in the same contest for a ground attack aircraft. That competition was won by the A-20. Ironically, both aircraft would ultimately become famous not as attack planes, but as medium bombers. A very different reputation among pilots belonged to the bomber produced by the Martin Company, which emerged from Baltimore assembly halls in late 1940 as a replacement for the B-18 BOLO. Traditionally, this aircraft is remembered primarily for its appearance. It was undeniably beautiful. And beauty was supposed to imply speed, range, and altitude. Yet the B-26 Marauder earned far darker nicknames among aircrews: Widowmaker, Husband Killer, and the Baltimore Whore. A single engine failure during landing almost inevitably resulted in a crash. The extremely forward center of gravity turned takeoff into a nightmare, making the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Ground crews were forced to move as much weight as possible into the tail just to make operations manageable. In flight, the B-26 could be utterly unpredictable. It was no coincidence that all combat aircraft were assigned to the 22nd Bombardment Group, whose pilots were among the most highly trained in the U.S. Army Air Forces. By July 1941, out of 66 delivered bombers, only 21 were flying. The rest stood idle, not because they were defective, but because crews were simply afraid to fly them. Combat use of the B-26 began only on April 5, 1942, with an attack on Rabaul. In April and May, the 22nd Group carried out 16 raids, followed by another 36 sorties by the end of 1942. Losses were so severe that in January 1943 the group was re-equipped with B-25s. By mid-1943, all remaining Widowmakers in the Pacific were concentrated in the 19th Squadron, which continued operations in the Southwest Pacific until January 1944. After that, the U.S. Army Air Forces preferred not to use the B-26 in the Pacific at all. The success of the A-20, however, pushed Douglas to continue developing the concept. In 1940, the company received a contract for 3 experimental prototypes: the XA-26 attack bomber with a dedicated bombardier, the XA-26A night fighter, and the XA-26B ground attack variant. After flight testing, the Army Air Corps placed an order for the A-26B Invader, a direct successor to the A-20. Combat use began in November 1944. The A-26 was arguably the only U.S. attack bomber to demonstrate real success in that role. Armed with anywhere from 10 to 20. .50 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying over 1,800 kilograms of bombs, it became the most effective American aircraft for close air support. With a top speed of 571 kilometers per hour, it was also the fastest bomber in U.S. service at the time. In practice, however, it was used mainly as a tactical bomber. Lacking armor protection for the crew, engines, and critical systems, it suffered painful losses whenever it encountered strong air defenses. Although the military pressed for additional protection, such upgrades were considered a low priority because they would significantly degrade flight performance. One must also mention Lockheed bombers developed on the eve of the war from the Model 18 Lodestar transport. The B-34 Lexington, B-37, PV-1 Ventura, and PV-2 Harpoon, produced in a combined total of 3,028 aircraft, were almost unique in U.S. service for performing their intended missions throughout the entire war: maritime patrol, anti-submarine warfare, and naval strike operations. Yet the most common bomber in the Pacific was none other than the North American B-25 Mitchell. Its prototype, designated NA-40, first flew in January 1939. Competitors in the original contest included the Douglas Model 7A, which won and entered production as the A-20, the Martin X-A-22 Maryland, later an export attack aircraft, and the Boeing Stearman X-A-21. Another contender, the Bell Model 9, was rejected at the design stage. North American lost the ground attack competition, but the company was given a second chance by refining the design as a bomber. The revised prototype, designated NA-62, entered a new competition against the Martin Model 179, Douglas B-23, and Stearman P-23. Once again, victory went to the aerodynamically superb Martin B-26. Martin received a contract for 200 aircraft worth over $15 million. As a consolation, the Army Air Corps allowed North American to continue development. On September 10, 1939, a contract was signed for 184 B-25 Mitchell bombers, valued at over $11 million. The first production B-25 flew on August 19, 1940, and by February 1941 the aircraft began entering service with the 17th Bombardment Group based at Pearl Harbor. The combat debut was unremarkable. After losing several aircraft at Pearl Harbor, the 17th Group was quickly reassigned to patrol duties along the U.S. West Coast. In March 1942, 48 B-25GS intended for the Dutch East Indies were transferred to Australia and instead assigned to the 3rd Bombardment Group. Throughout 1942, the 13th and 90th Squadrons, along with the 38th Group arriving in August, operated over New Guinea and surrounding areas. The B-25 proved far better suited to local airfields than the temperamental B-26, prompting the re-equipment of the 22nd Group as well. Almost simultaneously, in June 1943, the 345th Group was transferred to New Guinea. The Pacific theater was defined by vast distances, the absence of a continuous front line, and a lack of dense air defenses. As a result, B-25s were primarily used to hunt shipping and strike airfields around Rabaul. In March 1943, B-25 successfully attacked a large Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea, bombing from low altitude after suppressing anti-aircraft fire with machine guns. A follow-up strike sank one destroyer, damaged another, and hit two transports. American and Australian crews continued attacking the convoy for 3 days, effectively disrupting Japanese landings at La. B-25s were also heavily employed in Burma and China, where their main targets were Japanese supply lines, especially the single-track railway from Rangoon, along which more than 100 bridges were located. After many failed attempts, American crews succeeded in destroying 8 of them. B-25H gunship variants were heavily used during the Allied offensive in Burma in 1944. That summer, the bombers also laid mines in the Chindwin River. By July 1944, total B-25 strength in the region reached 345 aircraft. B-25G and B-25H variants supported amphibious operations in the Marshalls, Carolines, and Bismarck Archipelago, and also operated against Japanese forces from Alaska. Yet the most famous chapter in the Mitchell's history remains the Tokyo raid of April 18, 1942. 16 B-25B bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet. On April 2, 1942, the carrier task force departed San Francisco and crossed the Pacific. To avoid powerful Japanese naval forces, the bombers were launched from the maximum possible distance. All participating aircraft were ultimately lost. Of the 80 aircrew members, 3 were killed, 7 wounded, and 8 captured. The rest eventually made their way home. Doolittle was promoted to general, and American morale, shattered after Pearl Harbor, began to recover. The development paths of the B-25 and B-26 clearly illustrate the defining trend in American medium bomber design: simplified piloting and maintenance, improved visibility, and better crew comfort. These improvements often came at the expense of raw flight performance. But in conditions of mass employment and air superiority, such compromises proved acceptable.